I think many people know who Padre Pio was. He's a very famous Capuchin who lived towards the central south part of Italy. And in the northern part of Italy, and almost the opposite side of Italy in terms of north-south, was this Leopold Mandic. They both were contemporaries. They both lived around the same time. You know, the Capuchins, they're obviously famous for the coffee, which was named after them. They're also famous for looking like Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Well, it's really the other way around. And so that's who the Capuchins are. They walk around in these old brownish type of robes. And they're spiritual giants, although many of them were very tiny. And the thing about, which, you know, it's obvious that our dear Leopold was a little different than some of the other saints. And one of the things that made Leopold different was that he really was very sickly. He couldn't speak very well. In fact, he had a stuttering problem. He had arthritis. His back was always arched over. And he suffered a lot of physical ailments. And the thing about him that I think is so incredible is that he teaches us about something that maybe is a little bit underrated in our life, which is called vicarious suffering. Vicarious suffering, which is to atone or to take on the suffering of others so that they don't have to feel that pain, or that spiritually speaking, you share the pain with them and carry their pain as well. Vicarious suffering, it's kind of like empathetic salvific pain. So again, the difference of what Leopold was doing as opposed to Padre Pio. Padre Pio, when you would come into confessional with him, he could read your soul. And so some people come into confession and they're very, well, let's say general, you know, Father, I got mad at my sister. I looked at inappropriate things and this and that. And he'd be like, okay, why did you get wasted and then go do that? And he knew, Padre Pio did exactly the sins of the penitents. And if they weren't ready, like he knew what they were going to do, or they did, he would kick them out. You know, it's kind of like if you're in the penalty box and you did a fight in the penalty box, then in a hockey game you get kicked out of the penalty box. Imagine that. So that's what Padre Pio, he had this ability. So he was a little bit edgier, definitely a very kind and warm man, but definitely somebody who would wrestle the devil and wouldn't be afraid of all kicking people out of the confessional if they weren't prepared. Leopold Mandic was the exact opposite. He was always very warm. He was always very kind. And even if somebody came in with the most atrocious laundry list of sins, he would just say, okay, just go pray one Hail Mary. And so some of the friars started to take on to what he was doing. They hear the rumors and also this capacity that he had to not just take the penance of his penitents. In other words, he would do the penance that was due to some of the crazy things these people were confessing. But he also had the gift of being able to cure others' ailments. And they started to realize that all these ailments that he had, they started to come onto his life as he started to do more apostolic work with the people. And so one of the friars noticed that he had this ability to cure people. And they knew that he was too humble to admit that. So they asked him about St. Don Bosco, who was a saint before that, who also had this gift of being able to cure those who are sick. And so the friar said to Leopold, how do you think Don Bosco was able to cure people? And Leopold stepped back and he looked at him and he said, don't ever pray for that gift of curing others. And they're like, well, why? Because they all thought, hey, that's pretty cool. You know, somebody comes up with a headache, boom, they're done. You know, or if they have a broken leg, boom, they're walking. So you imagine how much, you could probably do a lot of good by doing that. Or imagine if you had coronavirus and you came up and Leopold could just cure you. And he said the reason not to pray for that is because what Don Bosco had to do was he would pray over them. He would relieve them of their ailment, but he would take on the physical pain that would have been due to that ailment. And so my man was, he was like Yoda. He was like that big. And he lived in a box that was, they had this room preserved which you could just barely fit into. But he was a giant because he assumed he vicariously took on the suffering of all the people that came to him. whether it be through the confessional, through the merciful love of God, or through the physical gift that he had of curing others. Now, I know that all of us are suffering in different ways during this coronavirus. There are many people who we serve every day now who do not have enough food, who wonder where the next paycheck is coming from. There's over 33 million people who are unemployed. The daily count of people suffering and dying, and then there's obviously all the other normal ailments of cancer and things that are trying our hearts, and perhaps there's disappointments and fears, there's maybe relationship issues, marriage, family, all these problems that continue to strike our hearts, or the death of a loved one, the loss of people who we care about. These are all things that cause our hearts to truly fall into despair. And as a saint, St. Leopold, what he did was he would look at the suffering of others and vicariously take that on. In other words, represent that person in taking on that suffering. And that was the way he prayed. That's the way he lived his priesthood. Imagine if today we think of one person in our life who's suffering a lot and really offer up little sacrifices. Maybe it's the sacrifice of doing the dishes for your mom, knowing that this is Mother's Day week. See, Mother's Day is not a weekend. It's actually a week. It actually should be a whole month of May. But you know what I mean? And so you start to take on the suffering. You start to absorb, so to speak. You're the shock absorber for that person that is driving through life, hitting these potholes. And so you start to pray for them. You start to think about them. You start to talk with them. And you try to share whatever it is that they're going through, and perhaps even get to the point of having that same gift of relieving others of their suffering. You see, what Leopold ended up doing was he stopped thinking about his own suffering because he united all the suffering that he saw around him to the suffering of Jesus Christ. And that's why he died, I think, 70-something years old in 1942. He's a modern-day saint that spent his life vicariously suffering for others. During this worldwide pandemic, Leopold Mandic should definitely be a top 5 saint. If he's not your top 5 saint, allow some of these great saints who did stuff like this to find you today and inspire us to be like a saint.